While the vast majority of people around the world today subsist on produced foods, it's likely that the oldest form of subsistence among humans was that of foraging, a term that refers to hunting, fishing, and gathering wild plants. Today, only some 0.005% of humans are foragers, which is really small, right? And most of those people who engage in foraging use this fairly rare subsistence pattern to supplement the food they obtain from other sources, such as horticulture or trading with agricultural neighbors. Yet, foraging has played such an important role in the history of human subsistence patterns that it's still worth considering here. Understanding foragers today gives us an insight into our own murky past. So, what do we know about foragers? Well, foragers by necessity must move from place to place in order to find the food they gather from the environment. Just imagine, if you survive on wild foods you hunt and gather, but you don't move, you'll die. Within a few weeks, perhaps, you've already eaten everything there is to eat around your camp. So you have to move. You have to migrate. And to accomplish this, you must be highly mobile. Like the Nambiquara of Brazil. They have very few material possessions, only what they can carry on their backs. Rather, whatever the women can carry, since they're the ones who carry everything while they migrate, so that the men can continue to hunt. The necessity of mobility, and hence few material possessions, means that most members of a foraging group have about the same amount and kind of possessions, which means that there's no class distinction, no obvious social or economic divisions. Everyone is relatively equal, at least in terms of economic prosperity, and that includes the food. Whatever food they hunt or gather is shared equally. Limited access to food means that foraging communities are typically quite small, fewer than 100 people in size. Your whole community might be no more than 20 or 30 people, and that's it. Larger populations would put a dangerous strain on food resources. Moreover, in foraging cultures, mothers often nurse their babies for a pretty long time, as much as 4 or 5 years, which makes it more difficult to get pregnant again. Foraging mothers therefore tend to have fewer babies, and more time passes between births. People hear about cultures like this and they think, oh, that sounds miserable. These people must be starving, always out there looking for food without a moment's rest. On the contrary, recent research has demonstrated that foragers actually tend to have more free time than producers do. For example, foraging Aboriginal Australian women spend only 20 hours a week performing domestic chores. You know, all the cooking and cleaning and childcare. Meanwhile, their housewife counterparts in the agricultural United States, with all their fancy appliances and advanced technology, spend some 55 hours a week performing domestic chores. I've already mentioned a couple of foraging cultures, but there's one in particular I'd like to spend more time talking about. A classic ethnographic study of a culture in Africa that has become a prime example of true foragers, people who only eat wild foods. And one characteristic that really stands out about these people, apart from their foraging, is their stature. You see, they're pygmies. You know, little people. How little? Well, the Mbuti pygmies, who live in the Ituri forest of the Democratic Republic of Congo, usually measure no more than 4 feet 10 inches in height. You might think, well, there can't be many of them out there, right? Actually, estimates are that there are today perhaps 150,000 pygmies living there. The mechanism by which the Mbuti remain relatively short is the absence of an insulin-like growth factor. They grow only about so high and then just stop. But the Mbuti do not refer to themselves as pygmies. Instead, they call themselves the Bamiki Bandura, or children of the forest, which suggests that they have been there longer than anyone else, doesn't it? And that may be true. In fact, the earliest accounts of pygmies living in the forests of Africa go all the way back to the earliest civilizations in history, including the ancient Egyptians, Greeks, and Romans. Homer himself noted their existence, as did Aristotle. But we knew relatively little about them until the British anthropologist Colin Turnbull lived with the Mbuti and studied them carefully in the 20th century. As nomadic foragers, Mbuti follow the typical pattern of all foragers, and that is in restricting the size of their camps. Mbuti hunting camps usually consist of around 20 or 30 people, moving through the forest at will, building temporary huts, and moving on again when food runs low. People come and go. You might leave the camp because of trouble finding food or because of a dispute between camp members. A Mbuti would consider the other members of his camp to be his family, whether or not they share any blood ties. Once he leaves that camp, those people stop being his family, and the members of his new camp become his new family. Men and women must work together to feed the community. Men do the hunting, usually with simple weapons, for instance, nets or bows and arrows that they make themselves. Meanwhile, the women gather food from the forest while trying to scare animals in the direction of their hunting husbands. Hunting is even important in getting married. If a young man wants to marry a woman, he usually tries to convince her parents that he's a good provider by going out on a hunt and bringing them an animal he has brought down, such as an antelope. Otherwise, marriage choices are really left up to the young men and women of the camp, who usually decide to get married, they say, not out of love, but because they want to have a child together. And the camp knows that they are married because the couple have built their first hut together. No other ceremony is necessary.